She was left to die in a blizzard by the family that was supposed to love her. He was a broken man who had stopped believing the living deserved his mercy. What happened inside that cabin during the coldest winter in 40 years would either destroy them both or give them something neither had dared want again. If you've ever been thrown away by someone who should have protected you, this story is going to hit different. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels, and stay with me until the very end. The wagon was already gone by the time Evelyn Hart understood what was happening. She had heard the horses first, the crack of reins, the impatient stamping of hooves on packed snow, and she had thought, stupidly, that they were only stopping to adjust the load. That was the kind of woman she had been for the past 3 years, the kind who assumed the best about people who deserved none of it. She had stood at the edge of the rutted trail with her traveling case in one hand and the cold eating through her thin wool coat, watching the back of the Blackwood wagon shrink into the white curtain of the blizzard. She called out once. The wind swallowed her voice like it was nothing. She called out again, louder this time, and the only answer was the groan of pine trees bending under the weight of ice. They didn't stop. They didn't even slow down. It had started 2 days earlier in the Blackwood family parlor, which was the kind of room designed to make people feel small. Heavy, dark furniture, portraits of dead relatives arranged to stare down at whoever sat beneath them, a fireplace large enough to stand inside but never warm enough to reach the far walls. Evelyn had sat in the chair they put her in, always the chair they chose, never one she selected herself, and listened while Edmund Blackwood, her dead husband's father, explained the family's decision. "You have been here 14 months since Daniel passed," Edmund said. He had the voice of a man accustomed to speaking at people rather than with them. "In that time you have produced no heir. You have provided no evidence that the pregnancy we were promised will ever materialize. And frankly, Evelyn, your presence in this house has become a source of considerable distress." Evelyn had folded her hands in her lap and said nothing. She had learned that lesson early in her marriage, that speaking before a Blackwood man finished speaking only created more problems for herself. "We have decided," Edmund continued, "that you will be transported to the western property, the old ranch near Harrow Creek. You'll have shelter, basic provisions for the season, and your personal belongings." He paused as if waiting for gratitude. "This is a generous arrangement given the circumstances." "Given what circumstances?" Evelyn asked, quietly, carefully. Edmund's expression didn't change. "Given that you contributed nothing of value to this family and took considerably more than you gave." She had wanted to say 1,000 things in that moment. She had wanted to tell him that his son had been a kind man trapped inside a family that didn't understand kindness, that Daniel had died from a fever that had nothing to do with her, that she had nursed him through 4 brutal weeks of illness while every Blackwood in the house found reasons to be elsewhere. She had wanted to remind Edmund that the failure to conceive a child was not exclusively a woman's failing. The doctors had told them as much, and that Edmund had paid those doctors to alter their reports so the blame could fall where the family preferred it to land. She said none of it, because Gideon was standing by the door. Daniel's older brother was built like something carved from old timber, wide shoulders, thick neck, a face that had never learned to produce a genuine smile. He had disliked Evelyn from the first day Daniel brought her home, and he had spent 3 years finding small ways to demonstrate that dislike. A missing letter here, a canceled appointment there, servants quietly instructed to ignore her requests. He was the kind of man who enjoyed having power over things and called it order. He was watching her with an expression that told her exactly how this conversation would go if she pushed back. So she had gone upstairs, packed her case, and come back down to be driven away. She hadn't expected them to simply stop the wagon 6 miles from the nearest town and leave her standing in the road, but she probably should have. The cabin appeared through the snow like a rumor, dark shapes that gradually became a low roof, a chimney, a structure solid enough to block some of the wind. Evelyn had been walking for what she estimated was 40 minutes, though time had become difficult to track with her hands numb and her breath coming in short, painful pulls. The cold wasn't like ordinary cold anymore. It had gotten past her coat and past her skin and was working on something deeper, something she couldn't quite name, and she understood with a clarity that surprised her that she was in genuine danger. She could see light in one window, small, yellowish, steady. Someone was home. She made it to the porch, 3 steps up, rickety railing, roof overhead, and knocked on the door. Her knuckles had gone so stiff she could barely feel the impact, so she knocked harder, then harder still. "Go away," a voice said from inside. It wasn't the voice she expected. Lower than she'd imagined, rougher, the kind of voice that had forgotten it was supposed to be used for conversation, like a man clearing rust from old machinery. "Please," Evelyn said, "I need help. I was left on the road and I've been walking, and I think I need to come inside or something is going to go very wrong." Silence. Then, "Who left you?" An odd question. Not where did you come from or are you hurt, but who left you, as if the person responsible was the most important piece of information. "The Blackwoods," she said. "I'm Evelyn Hart. My husband was Daniel Blackwood. He passed last year and his family drove me out here and abandoned me on the trail." More silence. "Please," she said again, and she was surprised to find that the word came out smaller than she intended, more desperate, and that she was shaking badly enough now that the porch steps were moving under her. Or possibly that was her legs. The door opened. Rowan Creed was not what she expected, though later she would wonder what exactly she had been expecting. He was somewhere around 40, with the kind of face that had spent too many years in wind and sun, weathered in a way that made it difficult to read, deep lines around the eyes, jaw covered in several days of dark beard going gray at the edges. He was tall, broad enough to fill most of the doorway, and he was holding a lantern in one hand and looking at her the way a man looks at a problem he hasn't decided what to do with yet. He looked at her. He looked past her at the snow-buried road. He looked at the traveling case she'd managed to keep hold of through 40 minutes of fighting wind and cold. "You walked from where they left you?" he asked. "Yes." "In that coat?" She looked down at herself. The coat was soaked through now, clinging to her shoulders, probably more weight than warmth at this point. "It's all I have." He stepped back from the door. Not exactly an invitation, more like a withdrawal of the obstacle. She took it as permission and came inside. The cabin was one room, essentially. A main space with a fireplace on the far wall, burning low but steady, a rough table with 2 chairs, a cot against the near wall, shelving along 2 sides, and a doorway covered by a heavy curtain that she guessed led to another small room. It smelled like pine smoke and something cooking, and the particular smell of a space where a man lived alone. Not unclean exactly, just stripped down to its basic purpose, with no consideration for anything decorative or comfortable. The fire was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She went to it without asking and put her hands out toward it and stood there for a long moment with her eyes closed, feeling the warmth start to work its way back through the layers of cold. "Sit down before you fall down," Rowan said from behind her. She sat. He disappeared through the curtained doorway and came back with a blanket that had seen better days but was thick and dry, and he dropped it around her shoulders without ceremony, the way you'd cover a shivering dog, and she pulled it tight and thought that was probably the kindest thing anyone had done for her in over a year. "You're a Blackwood widow," he said. He had taken up a position by the far wall, arms crossed, watching her with that flat, unreadable look. "Daniel Blackwood." "Yes. I knew of him. Heard he was decent for a Blackwood." "He was. And they drove you out here in a blizzard." It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. "Edmund said I was being taken to the western property, the ranch near Harrow Creek. He said there'd be shelter and provisions." She paused. "They stopped the wagon on the road and told me to get out. Gideon said I knew the way from there." Something moved across Rowan's face. It was brief and difficult to interpret. Not quite anger, not quite something softer, just a shift, like weather changing behind a mountain. "Harrow Creek Ranch is 12 miles from where that road ends," he said. "I didn't know that." "No, you wouldn't." He looked at the fire for a moment. They did know it. The silence that followed that statement was different from the silences before it. Evelyn sat with it and felt something cold that wasn't the weather settle into her stomach. "You can stay the night," Rowan said finally. "Storm's going to be bad. In the morning, we'll figure out what to do with you." What to do with you? Like she was a stray animal or a piece of equipment someone had left on his property. She should have been offended. She was too exhausted and cold and relieved to be anything at all. "Thank you," she said. He grunted, not unfriendly exactly, just not practiced at being friendly, and went back to whatever he'd been doing before she knocked on his door. The storm lasted 3 days. Not the pleasant, quiet kind of snowfall that people in warmer places imagine when they think of mountain winters. This was the kind of storm that had intentions, wind that could drive snow horizontally into every crack in a structure, temperatures that dropped past the point of any thermometer Evelyn had ever seen, cold so absolute it made the air inside the cabin hurt to breathe even with the fire going full strength. Rowan went outside twice a day to see to his animals. He had 3 horses, a small flock of chickens in a lean-to he'd insulated himself, and a pair of sled dogs that spent the storm curled against each other in the barn. Each time he went out, he was gone for 30 or 40 minutes, and each time he came back, he was ice-crusted and silent and went directly to the fire without speaking. Evelyn tried to make herself useful. It wasn't entirely selfless, she understood, with a practical clarity that surprised her that being useful was her best protection against being put back outside when the storm broke. But it was also that sitting still made her think, and thinking led in directions she couldn't afford to follow yet. She explored the cabin carefully on that first morning when Rowan was outside with the animals. The shelves held canned goods, dried meat, tools, rope, oil for lamps, traps of various sizes, and a collection of carving tools alongside a set of small finished pieces. Animals, mostly, carved from wood with a level of skill that suggested either practice or something closer to obsession. A bear, a rabbit, an elk with antlers fine enough that she was afraid to touch them. She stood and looked at those carvings for a long time. She found the wolf later, tucked behind a coffee tin on the highest shelf. It was smaller than the others, worn smooth from handling, painted once in a color that had faded to a ghost of itself. It wasn't like the other pieces. It was rougher, simpler, shaped by someone less skilled, or possibly by someone whose hands had been shaking when they made it. There was a loop of string through a hole drilled in its back, the kind of loop a child could wear around their neck. She put it back exactly where she found it and didn't mention it. She made soup with what she found in the pantry. Dried beans, a partial onion that had seen better days, strips of dried venison that needed serious reconstituting before they'd be edible. She wasn't a cook of any particular distinction, but she knew how to make something from limited materials because she'd grown up in a household where that skill was necessary. The soup was functional, hot. It filled a bowl. When Rowan came back from his second trip outside that first day and found her standing at his stove, he stopped in the doorway and stared at her for long enough that she started to feel she'd done something wrong. "I found the dried venison," she said, "and the beans. I hope that's all right." He looked at the pot. He looked at her. "It's fine," he said, and took off his coat. He ate 2 bowls without comment, and then sat at the table with a piece of wood and one of his carving knives and worked in silence for the rest of the evening. Evelyn read from the single book she'd packed, a collection of poetry she'd grabbed almost at random in the panic of packing, and tried not to watch him work too obviously. He wasn't a comfortable presence. There was a density to him, a weight, the way you feel something heavy in the room even with your back turned. Not threatening exactly, more like a large rock formation that had been in one place for so long it had become part of the landscape, unmovable, indifferent to weather. She didn't know yet whether that quality would be something she could live with or something that would slowly drive her insane. On the second day of the storm, the roof of the barn section collapsed under the snow load. Evelyn heard the crack from inside, a sound like a gunshot, followed by a deep groaning and then a crash that shook the walls of the cabin. And before she'd quite processed what had happened, Rowan was already moving, coat half on, pulling on his boots without sitting down, the way a man moves when catastrophe is something he's already practiced dealing with. "Stay here," he said. She stayed for approximately 90 seconds before she put on every layer she had and went after him. The barn was a disaster. One entire section of the roof had given way under accumulated snow and ice, beams cracked, boards collapsed, and Rowan's 3 horses were in the far stall making the kind of noise horses make when they are seriously afraid. The chickens had not been in the collapsed section. The lean-to was intact. But one of the sled dogs, a gray female with one blue eye, had taken a beam to her flank and was down in the straw with a sound that was almost human. Rowan was already at the horse stalls, talking to them in a low voice that was completely unlike the voice he used with people. Softer, steadier, patient in a way she hadn't seen from him yet. She watched him get his hands on the nearest horse's halter and walk it in a slow circle, checking its legs, keeping it moving and away from panic. The dog, Evelyn said. I know, he said, without stopping what he was doing. She's hurt. I know. He got the second horse calmed and moved to the third. I'll get to her. I can look at her if you... Do you know anything about injured animals? She didn't answer that question. Then don't move her, he said. Talk to her. Stay near her. Just don't move her until I see what we're dealing with. So Evelyn knelt in the freezing straw beside the gray dog and put her hand on the animal's side and talked. Not about anything meaningful. About the soup she was making, about the poetry book she'd been reading, about the way the fireplace crackled differently in different weather. The dog's breathing was ragged and her eye was wide and terrified, but she didn't try to move, just lay there with Evelyn's hand on her side and her ears turned toward the voice. It took Rowan 20 minutes to get all three horses secure and assess the situation. Then he came to the dog, ran his hands over her carefully with a thoroughness that suggested experience, and sat back on his heels. 2 ribs, maybe 3, he said. She's lucky it wasn't her spine. Can you treat that? Not much to treat. Bind her. Keep her still. Keep her warm. He looked at the collapsed section of roof, and then back at the dog, and then at Evelyn, who was still kneeling in the straw with one hand on the animal's side. Something shifted in his expression, briefly, and then settled back into its usual flatness. You can bring her inside, if she'll let you. Evelyn looked at him. To the cabin? Unless you'd rather she freeze out here. No, I just thought you might not want... She's been with me 8 years, he said. He looked at the dog, not at Evelyn, when he said it. She stays inside until she heals. The dog's name was Scout. Rowan mentioned this matter-of-factly while he was fashioning a binding for her ribs out of strips cut from an old shirt, kneeling on the cabin floor with the animal lying flat and still, apparently trusting him completely, even through the pain of being handled. How did you learn to do that? Evelyn asked, watching from nearby. Did a lot of it, he said. Trapping and hunting, things get hurt. Have you always lived out here? In the mountains? He didn't answer right away. She was learning that his silences weren't necessarily evasion. Sometimes they were just him deciding whether a question deserved an answer. No, he said finally. Had a place in Red Haven for a while. Years ago. Red Haven was the nearest town of any real size, 12 miles east of the valley. She'd passed through it twice in her time with the Blackwoods, and remembered it as the kind of town that had opinions about everything and kept them loudly. What made you leave? She asked. The silence this time was different, longer. Things change, he said, and his tone made it clear that was all she was getting on that subject. She didn't push. She knew something about things changing, about the way a life could reorganize itself around a loss until you barely recognize what remained. She knew you didn't push on those places and other people, because you didn't want them pushing on your own. Scout slept near the fire that night. The other sled dog, a darker male named Trace, had been brought in as well, because the barn was not safe shelter anymore, and the storm was still howling outside. Evelyn slept on the cot where Rowan had put her on the first night, and she assumed Rowan was sleeping on his own bed behind the curtain, but when she woke at some point in the deep middle of the night, she could see him sitting by the fire with Scout's head in his lap, awake, one hand resting lightly on the dog's side. Just sitting, watching the fire, keeping watch over something that mattered to him. She closed her eyes before he could see that she was awake. On the third day, the storm broke. The silence that followed was almost shocking. After 3 days of wind, the absence of it felt physical, like pressure releasing from your ears. Evelyn woke to actual sunlight, thin and cold and coming sideways through the single window, and lay on the cot for a moment blinking at the unfamiliar sight. Rowan was already up, already dressed, already at the table with coffee he'd somehow managed to make without waking her. He looked at her when she sat up. "Storm's done," he said. "I can see that. Roads will be passable in a day or two, maybe sooner if we get wind." She understood what he was doing, not unkindly. He was being straightforward with her about the timeline, the same way he was straightforward about everything. The storm is done. Roads will be clear. That's how long you have here. "I need to figure out where I'm going," she said. Yes. She sat on the edge of the cot and looked at the fire and thought about it. She had approximately $4 and some change in the small purse she'd managed to keep in her coat pocket. She had a traveling case of clothes, most of which were too fine for any practical work and not fine enough to impress anyone important. She had no family of her own. Her parents had died within a year of each other before her marriage, and she was an only child. She had no friends in this part of the territory because the Blackwoods had made sure to keep her isolated from anyone who might have helped her develop loyalties outside the family. She had nothing, essentially. She was 31 years old, and she had nothing. "The ranch," she said, "the one they were supposedly sending me to. Is it empty?" Rowan wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "Far as I know, Blackwoods haven't used it in years, but it's not habitable. No heat, roof in bad shape, no supplies. But it's technically a Blackwood property that was promised to me. Promised isn't the same as legal." "No," she agreed. She thought for another moment. "What about work? In town? Is there any?" "Depends what you can do. I can cook, I can sew, I can read and write and do figures. I managed a household of 8 for 3 years. She paused. "I can learn other things." He looked at her over his coffee cup, that flat, assessing look. "Most of the women working in Red Haven right now are working in the saloons or the laundry. Nothing wrong with the laundry, but it's hard work for low pay. I'm not afraid of hard work." "Didn't say you were." He set down the cup. "What I'm saying is it's the middle of winter, the roads are rough, and you don't have anywhere to go today. So the question of what you're going to do tomorrow doesn't need an answer right this minute." She looked at him. He looked back at her. "You can stay," he said. It came out slightly awkward, like a word in a language he didn't use often. "For a while, until you've got something figured out. You do the cooking and whatever inside work needs doing. I'll keep the fire going and deal with the outside." "That's very—" "No, don't make it into something it isn't," he said. "Winter alone out here is hard. I lost 2 weeks last year to a bad cold because there was nobody to keep the fire going when I couldn't get out of bed. It's a practical arrangement, not charity." She thought about calling him on that, because it was charity, clearly, whatever he wanted to call it. But she didn't, because she recognized that he was a man who needed to frame his kindness as something other than kindness in order to offer it at all. "Practical arrangement," she agreed. "When spring comes, you go." "When spring comes, I go," she agreed. They shook hands across the table with the formality of a business deal neither of them quite believed, and that was how it started. What nobody tells you about surviving together is how much of it is negotiating the small things. The first week was genuinely difficult, not because of any dramatic conflict, more because two people who had each spent significant time alone have to relearn how to occupy shared space without driving each other to distraction. Evelyn was a morning person. Rowan apparently needed at least an hour of silence before he was fit for human interaction. Evelyn had opinions about where things should be stored. Rowan had a system, incomprehensible to her, but apparently coherent to him, and was grimly resistant to any alteration of it. Evelyn wanted to air out the cabin whenever the weather allowed. Rowan found this unnecessary and mildly suspicious. They argued about the firewood. "You're burning it too fast," he said on the 4th day, coming in from outside to find her adding a log to a fire that was, by his estimation, perfectly adequate already. "I'm cold," she said. "You're wearing inside clothes. You should have a second layer in the evenings." "I don't have unlimited layers to—" "I have extra." He went to the chest against the wall and dug out a thick flannel shirt that had probably been washed twice since 1869 and dropped it on the table. "Wear that. Don't burn the wood I spent 3 days splitting just because you're cold when there are other options." She put on the shirt. It came to her knees and the sleeves fell past her hands, and she had to roll them up 4 times to make them functional. It was warm, she would admit that. The flannel had absorbed years of wood smoke and body heat, and it smelled powerfully of both. "Thank you," she said, making it approximately 4 syllables. He made a sound that might have been acknowledgement and went back to what he was doing. But the firewood wasn't really about the firewood, and they both knew it. It was about 2 people with entrenched habits and absolute zero experience with compromise learning what the shape of a shared life looked like. It was ugly sometimes. There were silences that lasted entire meals. There were moments when she caught herself thinking seriously about whether she could make it to town on her own and what the frostbite risk actually was. Then there were other moments. He started teaching her things the second week. She wasn't sure if it was deliberate or if he simply ran out of reasons not to. They were outside after a storm had knocked over part of the fence line, and she was trying to be useful by holding boards while he hammered, and she managed to do it wrong enough times that he finally took the boards away from her and showed her how to brace them properly. Standing behind her, hands over her hands, adjusting the angle without a word of explanation, just repositioning until it was right. "Like that," he said. "Like that," she repeated. "Hold it." She held it. He drove the nail clean. It sounds small. It was small. But there was something about being shown how to do a thing rather than told to step aside, about being taught rather than managed, that was different from anything she'd experienced in 3 years of marriage, where the message had always been, gently but consistently, that the Blackwood house had systems and her job was to fit into them. He showed her how to load and fire his spare rifle. This was explicitly practical. If anything happened to him while he was out checking traps, she needed to be able to get food and to protect herself. She was a terrible shot at first, the recoil knocking her sideways the first time, and he watched this without expression, waited until she'd recovered herself, and said only, "Lean into it." "Lean into it," she said mostly to herself, and she did. She got better. He showed her how to read the weather from cloud formations and wind direction, which turned out to be more reliable than any almanac she'd ever consulted. He showed her which of the dried provisions needed to be rationed and which were plentiful and why. He showed her how to render fat for waterproofing, how to mend snowshoes, how to build a fire in wet conditions using materials you'd never expect to burn. She taught him things too, in a quieter way. How to get a full week's worth of meals from a single smoked ham. How to stitch a wound closed. She'd learned this from a book, never practiced it on a person, but he had a cut on his forearm from a trap that needed closing, and she was steadier about it than he expected, and he let her do it without arguing. She was good with the accounts. He had a rough tally system that she streamlined into something he could actually read back months later, because frontier life required knowing precisely what you had and what you'd need before the next supply run. The learning went both ways, and neither of them acknowledged it out loud. That was how they managed it, pretending it was all purely practical, pretending neither of them noticed the slow, awkward warmth developing in the space between two people who had both decided they were done needing anyone. The carving wolf came up on a night in late January when the cold had come back with a specific cruelty, temperatures so low that the sap in the pine trees froze and cracked with sounds like gunshots in the dark, startling them both awake at irregular intervals through the night. They had given up on sleeping separately and were both sitting by the fire with blankets and coffee, Scout between them like an accidentally domestic arrangement, waiting for the temperature to find its floor. Evelyn had been reading again. She was 3/4 through the poetry collection and had started rationing pages, which was either a sign she liked it more than she'd expected or a sign she was significantly more desperate for reading material than she wanted to admit. She looked up at the shelf where the wolf was and then back at her book. She looked up again. "The wolf carving on the high shelf," she said. "The small one with the string. It's different from the others." Rowan was working on a new piece. An otter, she thought, though it was early in the process. He didn't answer right away. "Someone else made it," he said finally. She waited. "My daughter," he said. "She was 9. It was the first thing she ever finished." He turned the block of wood in his hands. She was proud of it, wore it around her neck every day. It wasn't particularly good, but she didn't care. She thought it was the best thing she'd ever made. The fire made the only sound in the cabin for a moment. "What was her name?" Evelyn asked. "Clara. Clara." She let the name sit in the space between them without trying to do anything with it. "She died from the fever," Rowan said. His voice hadn't changed pitch or pace. It was still that same flat, careful voice, but she could hear the weight it was carrying under the surface. "Both of them. My wife Margaret went first. Clara held on for another week, but the fever had her lungs. There wasn't—" He stopped. "There wasn't anything that would have made a difference. I know that now. At the time, I tried everything." "How long ago?" Evelyn asked. 7 years. 7 years. She thought about what 7 years of that grief would feel like, living out here in the silence with nothing but the mountains and the snow and that small worn wolf on the shelf. "I'm sorry," she said. And then, because she knew how empty those words were, "That's not enough." I know it isn't. No, he agreed, but there isn't enough for it. For some things, there just isn't. He looked at the carving in his hands. When I came out here, I thought I was just trying to get away from the noise of town. All the people acting like normal life was a thing that should still work for me. But I think I was also, I don't know, trying to stay close to where the memory was clear. Out here, things are simple. You know exactly what you have and what you've lost. She understood that. The Blackwood house had tried to make her feel like a woman without a history. Like she'd never existed before she arrived through their door. Like the only thing that mattered was what she could produce for them going forward. The cruelty of it was how thoroughly they'd succeeded. By the end, she'd catch herself uncertain about her own memories, wondering if what she remembered about her life before Daniel was accurate or just something she'd invented to feel less alone. "My husband was kind," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. He wasn't strong enough to stand against his family for me. I knew that before I married him. And I married him anyway because he was good, and I was 28, and I thought goodness was enough. She looked at the fire. He got sick in October. By March, he was gone. And I spent the next year watching his family turn me from a wife into an inconvenience and then into a problem they needed to solve. She told him about the doctor's reports, about Gideon moving her out of the main bedroom and into the servant wing under the pretense of making space for something that never materialized, about the letters she'd written to her husband's few friends that had never received replies. She found out later that the outgoing mail had been intercepted, though she couldn't prove it. "They took 14 months, she said, to reduce me down to the point where being put out in a blizzard felt like the natural conclusion of things. That's the part I'm still angry about. Not the blizzard, the 14 months. Rowan was quiet for a moment. "You should be angry about both," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire. "One doesn't cancel the other," he said. "The long, slow thing and the blizzard. You can be angry about all of it." It was such a simple thing to say. It was the kind of simple thing that lands differently in the dark, in the middle of winter, when someone who doesn't have any particular reason to see you clearly sees you anyway. "Scout is doing better," Evelyn said after a while, because the moment had gotten large enough that it needed something ordinary to balance it. "She is," Rowan agreed, and that was all. The fire burned low. The temperature outside kept cracking trees. They sat in the warmth they'd made between them and let the silence be comfortable for the first time. February arrived with a deceptive gentleness, a week of clearer skies that sent light bouncing off the snow in blinding sheets, temperatures that climbed far enough to make the cabin feel stuffy by afternoon. Scout was almost fully recovered, following Evelyn around the cabin with a loyalty that she suspected was partly genuine affection, and partly the fact that Evelyn had started slipping her scraps when Rowan wasn't looking. Rowan pretended not to notice. He was either more oblivious than she thought, or he'd decided not to care, and she suspected the latter. She had started working on the cabin's interior in small ways, not because anyone asked her to, more because she was a person who needed her hands occupied, and because the cabin had been existing at about 60% of its potential for so long that it was almost offensive. She repaired the loose hinge on the storage chest. She patched the spot in the near wall where cold air had been seeping in around a poorly sealed board. She made curtains out of a length of heavy cloth she found in the storage room, which transformed the one window from a cold source into something that actually held warmth against the glass. Rowan came home from a trap run one afternoon to find the curtains and stood looking at them for a long moment. "They're practical," Evelyn said before he could object. "Keeps the heat in." He looked at them for another moment. "They're blue," he said. "They are. I don't have anything blue in here." "You do now." He went to hang his coat up without another word. But later that evening, she caught him looking at the window again with an expression that was not dissatisfaction. That was February. Outside, the mountains held their silence. Inside the cabin, very quietly, without either of them naming it or acknowledging it directly, something was changing. Not dramatic. Nothing that would have been visible to anyone watching from outside. Just a slow warming of the air between two people who had both grown very good at keeping everything cold. Rowan started talking more at dinner. Not long speeches, he remained a man of disciplined economy with words, but questions sometimes. About her life before Daniel, about what she'd wanted when she was young, before the world had organized itself around limiting her options. She answered him carefully at first, then less carefully, then with the kind of honesty that surprised her when it came out. She wanted land, she's told him one evening. Not the social standing, not the house, just a piece of land she could work and call her own, where nobody could come and tell her she was doing it wrong or not producing enough or taking up too much space. He nodded at that, like it was the most sensible thing she'd said. "What do you want?" she asked. "You've been asking me things for 2 weeks, and I still don't know anything about what you want." He thought about it, not a short pause, a genuine consideration. "For things to be quieter than they were," he said. "For the work to be enough. For spring not to feel like something ending." She looked at him. He looked back at her, and he had the expression of a man who had just said something more honest than he'd planned to, and wasn't entirely sure how he felt about that. Outside, the February wind pushed against the windows and found the edges sealed with new cloth, and the cabin held its warmth against the cold the way it had been meaning to all along. March came in sideways, the way it always did in the mountains. Not a clean arrival, but a negotiation, some days carrying the first faint suggestion of warmth, others delivering cold that felt almost personal in its insistence. The snow didn't retreat so much as it reconsidered, pulling back from the south-facing slope during the afternoon hours and returning by nightfall, leaving a record of itself in the mud and dead grass it briefly exposed. Rowan said this was normal. He said it every year felt like the season was arguing with itself before finally giving in. Evelyn had stopped counting the days sometime in late February. She wasn't sure when exactly, only that she noticed one morning she no longer woke up calculating how much longer until the roads cleared and she could figure out what came next. The calculation had just quietly stopped, the way a sound you've gotten used to stops registering until it's gone. She wasn't sure what to make of that. The cabin had changed in ways that were difficult to articulate precisely because most of them were small. The blue curtains on the window were the most visible difference, but there were others. A hook she'd installed near the door so coats didn't end up piled on the floor. The way she'd reorganized the pantry shelves so similar items lived together instead of wherever they'd last been put down. The folded blanket on the chair nearest the fire that had simply migrated there one cold evening and never returned to the chest. Rowan hadn't commented on any of it. He used the hook. He found things on the pantry shelves without having to search. He took the blanket from the chair when he needed it and put it back when he was done, as naturally as if it had always been there. Small things. But in a space as stripped down as that cabin, small things were the whole vocabulary. Scout had healed well enough that she was back outside during the days, though she favored her right side in cold weather, and probably always would. Trace had appointed himself Evelyn's shadow indoors, a development that Rowan found either amusing or mildly irritating. She could never quite tell which, because his expressions for both looked similar. She'd started talking to Trace the way she'd talked to Scout during those first frightening hours in the barn. And somewhere along the way, it had become habit, a running commentary on whatever she was doing, and she'd caught Rowan listening from across the room with the careful stillness of someone pretending not to be paying attention. She didn't stop. If anything, she got worse. "I know you think the onions are done," she told Trace one morning while Rowan ate breakfast 6 feet away. "But they need another 5 minutes, and you're going to have to accept that." Trace thumped his tail on the floor. "He's not going to give you an onion," Rowan said, without looking up from his coffee. "I wasn't going to give him an onion. You were thinking about it." "I was absolutely not thinking about it." She was a little bit thinking about it. Rowan made a short sound. Not quite a laugh, more like the shape of one, the brief involuntary exhale of a man whose face has forgotten how laughter works, but whose body still remembers the mechanics. It was gone almost before it registered, but she caught it, filed it somewhere carefully, and went back to the onions. That was how March started. Little moments like that, accumulating without announcement. The repair work on the barn became their shared project by default. It needed doing before spring arrived and the rest of the structure deteriorated further, and it was easier with 2 people, and they were both available, so they did it together. Rowan knew construction well enough. He'd built parts of the cabin himself, replaced sections of the roof twice, knew how to notch joints and which wood held nails cleanly and which crumbled under pressure. Evelyn was not trained for any of it, but she was careful. She could follow specific instructions without needing them repeated, and she had stopped worrying about doing things perfectly, somewhere around the 3rd week of February, when she'd made a mistake setting a fence post, and Rowan had just said, "Pull it and try again," with the same tone he'd used to observe that the weather was changing. No frustration, no commentary on her competence, just information about what needed to happen next. She'd pulled it and tried again. It held. They worked in the mornings when the cold was still manageable and the light was best. Rowan framed the new section of roof while Evelyn hauled boards and held them steady and passed tools and asked questions. He answered with varying degrees of patience depending on how physically awkward the current position was. She learned more about structural repair in 3 weeks than she had in her entire previous life. She also learned that Rowan swore specifically when cold metal touched his hands. A short, sharp word. Always the same one. Always followed immediately by a brief pause, as if he were reminding himself she was present. "You don't have to stop on my account," she said one morning after the third instance. He looked at her from the ladder. "My mother," he said, "would disagree." "Your mother isn't here." "No," he said. "She isn't." He turned back to what he was doing. Old habits. She thought about his mother then, wondered what she'd been like, whether she was still alive somewhere, whether there was any family left that Rowan was connected to, or whether the isolation was total. She didn't ask. She'd learned to feel the outline of the questions he didn't want and work around them, the same way you work around a bruise on a piece of fruit. You know it's there, you're careful of it, you don't make it the center of everything. They ate lunch in the barn when the weather allowed, sitting on boards with whatever she'd packed in the morning. The first time she'd brought lunch out to him, he'd looked at the wrapped cloth with an expression she couldn't read and was quiet for a moment. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." He didn't say anything else about it, but he was always there when she came out with it, and he always ate every bit of whatever she'd brought. And one afternoon in the second week, he came back inside from feeding the horses to find her finishing her own lunch and set a fresh coffee cup on the table beside her without being asked, because he'd noticed she always wanted coffee after she ate and had apparently decided to stop waiting for her to get up and get it herself. She looked at the cup. She looked at him. He was already across the room, hanging up his coat. She drank the coffee and said nothing, because some things are understood better in silence. One afternoon near the end of the third week of work, they were closing up the last section of the barn roof and Rowan missed a nail. Not dangerously, just the angle was wrong, and the hammer glanced off the nail head and struck the board beside it, leaving a fresh dent in the wood that was absolutely cosmetic and didn't matter. But he stopped, looked at the dent, and then said something that surprised her. "Clara used to help me with things like this," he said. He wasn't looking at her, was looking at the board, the dent, some distance past both. She was too young, really, and her arms weren't strong enough to hold anything heavy, but she'd insist. She had opinions about where everything should go. Strong opinions. She got that from Margaret. He set the hammer down on the beam beside him. She would have been 16 this year. Evelyn didn't say anything for a moment. The barn held the particular silence of a large space in cold weather, sounds becoming strange and isolated. "What did she look like?" she asked. He was quiet. "Like Margaret," he said. "Mostly. But she had my nose, which Margaret considered a personal injustice." He picked the hammer back up. "She was funny. People don't always say that about children. They say smart or well-behaved or pretty. Clara was funny. She'd say things that knocked you sideways." "She sounds like someone I would have liked." He looked at her then. Not the assessing look, not the flat, careful one. Something different, more open, like a window before someone remembers to close it. "Yeah," he said quietly. "She was easy to like." He went back to work, and she did too, and neither of them spoke for a while, but the barn felt less empty than it had before. The repairs finished on a Thursday that came in unexpectedly warm, the temperature climbing past the point of comfort for heavy work, and they sat outside on the fence rail in the afternoon to let the sun do what it was attempting to do. Rowan had a cup of water. Evelyn had taken her coat off and tied it around her waist and turned her face toward the warmth with a lack of dignity that she was past caring about. "It's almost not miserable," she said. "High praise. I've recalibrated my standards." He was looking at the mountains. The snow line on the peaks was still sharp and white, but the lower slopes had taken on a brownish softness, the suggestion of underlying ground. He had that look he sometimes got outdoors, remote and settled, like the landscape was the one language he was fully fluent in. "You're thinking something," she said. "I'm usually thinking something. You have a specific thinking face. There's a version for practical problems. That's more like a frown. And then there's this one. She gestured vaguely at his profile. He turned to look at her with an expression suggesting he was not sure how he felt about being observed so closely. What does this one look like? Like you're somewhere else entirely and it's taking some effort. He was quiet for a moment. I was thinking about the planting, he said, whether there's enough of the south field clear by May to put in a kitchen garden. That's the frown one, she said. He looked at her and this time the almost laugh made it a little further. She could see it in the corner of his mouth, the deliberate work of keeping it contained. You're annoying, he said. You're the fourth person to tell me that, she said pleasantly. I've started taking it as a positive sign. He shook his head and looked back at the mountains, and she looked back at the sky. And the sun stayed warm on her face for another hour that felt like something she hadn't deserved and got anyway. The kitchen garden became real. They staked it out in the last week of March, marking the boundaries with rope and wooden stakes in the soft ground of the south field, arguing mildly about dimensions because she wanted it larger than he thought practical, and they eventually settled on something in between that neither of them was fully satisfied with, which Rowan said was what a good compromise felt like. Cynical, she said. Realistic, he corrected. She planted the first seeds in early April, peas and early greens, things that could handle the remaining cold snaps. And there was something about putting things in the ground with the intention of returning to see them come up that made her stop for a moment in the middle of a row, one hand in the dark soil, and understand something she hadn't consciously examined yet. She was planning to be here in the summer. She hadn't agreed to that. It wasn't what the arrangement said. When spring comes, you go. That was the deal, clearly stated, shaken on at the table in the first days of winter. Spring was coming. The roads were clearing. She had survived, which had been the actual goal. And now the actual goal had been achieved and the arrangement should be reaching its natural end. She was on her knees in the south field planning a summer garden. She sat back on her heels and looked at the stakes and the rope and the shallow furrows she'd made and tried to figure out what to do with that. She didn't bring it up that evening, or the next. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment, which was partially true and partially an excuse for avoiding a conversation she didn't know how to start. It was Rowan who started it. They were at dinner 10 days into April, the light outside holding longer now, in that way it does when winter finally accepts defeat. And he was eating and she was eating and the dogs were in their respective positions, and it was objectively an ordinary evening. Then Rowan set down his fork and looked at the table for a moment and said, without particular drama, "The roads have been clear for 2 weeks." "I know," she said. He looked at her. She looked at the table. "I don't have anything to go to," she said. She'd decided somewhere in the last 10 days that if this conversation happened, she was going to be honest. No posturing about having a plan. No performance of capability she didn't currently have. "I have $4 and some change. I don't have family. I don't have a position. I have a traveling case of clothes that aren't suitable for actual work." She paused. "I've been trying to decide what going means, and I can't make it into a picture that works." Rowan was quiet. "The saloon work," she said, "or the laundry. I could do either. I've been putting it off because—" She stopped, because the reason she'd been putting it off was that she didn't want to leave, and saying that out loud felt like a thing she couldn't take back. "I've been putting it off." "The laundry in Red Haven pays $3 a week," Rowan said. "Room and board are $2.50 of that, which leaves you 50 cents for everything else." "I know." "That's not viable." "I know that too." He looked at the window. The blue curtains held the dark outside. "You put in a kitchen garden." "I did." "It won't be ready until late June at the earliest." She looked at him carefully. "Someone should be here to tend it," he said, in the same flat, practical voice he'd used on that first morning. "It's a practical arrangement, not charity." And she understood that he was doing the same thing he'd done then, framing something true in the language of something easier. She could call him on it again. She could say clearly that this had moved past practical, and both of them knew it. She could say a number of things. "The peas will need watching in May," she said instead. "They bolt if you're not paying attention." "They do," he said. "So I should probably stay through May." "Probably makes sense," he said. She looked at her dinner. He looked at his. Outside, the first real spring frogs started up somewhere near the creek, that small, determined sound that is the actual announcement of seasonal change, not the calendar or the snow line, but those small creatures insisting on being heard. "Rowan," she said. "Evelyn," he said, same tone. "This is complicated." "Yes. I don't know what I'm doing." "I know," he said. "Neither do I." He picked his fork back up. "But the peas do need watching." She laughed. It came out unexpected and undignified, and she put her hand over her mouth and he looked up from his plate with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Startled, almost, and then something that loosened across his face like a knot releasing. A real smile that reached his eyes and was gone almost before it fully arrived, but she saw it. She saw it completely, and she held it the way you hold something breakable, carefully, without gripping too hard. She lowered her hand. "The peas," she said. "The peas," he agreed, and went back to eating, and the frogs kept going outside, and the cabin held the warmth of two people who had both stopped pretending they wanted to be somewhere else. April unfolded in the particular way of mountain springs, generous one day, treacherous the next. The ground never fully trusted until well past the point when you wanted to trust it. Evelyn learned this the hard way when she went out to check the garden after 3 warm days and sank to her ankle in mud that had looked solid from 10 feet back. She sat down hard in the cold muck and let out a word she hadn't used since the last time the Blackwood parlor had driven her to the inner limits of her composure. Rowan appeared from the direction of the barn, took one look at her sitting in the mud, and said nothing, which was somehow worse than if he'd said something. "Don't," she said. "I didn't say anything." "You were thinking very loudly." He walked over and held out his hand. She took it, and he pulled her up, and she came out of the mud with a sound that was mortifying, and her boot was covered past the ankle, and her dress was a lost cause, and she was cold and irritated and slightly embarrassed. And Rowan was still not saying anything, which meant he was either being respectful or he was about 30 seconds from saying something that would make her hit him. "The ground near the creek runs wet for another 3 weeks," he said. "Stay to the right side of the marker stakes." "I didn't know there were marker stakes." "There are now." He let go of her hand. "I put them in yesterday." She looked at him. "After the 3rd time I nearly went in myself," he said, in a tone that cost him something to produce. "Last year. In the same spot." She looked at his face very carefully. "You went in the mud." "Not as far as you." "But you went in. The point," he said with a patience that was visibly effortful, "is to stay right of the stakes." She looked at the distant stakes, then back at him, and he looked back at her with an expression that was working very hard at seriousness, and she burst out laughing again, which seemed to be happening more than it had in years. These involuntary escapes of laughter, genuine ones, the kind you couldn't manage in front of people you were still performing for. He shook his head, turned, walked back toward the barn. "Thank you for the steaks," she called after him. He raised a hand without turning around. Not a wave exactly, more like an acknowledgement that the conversation had concluded in a satisfactory manner. She cleaned her boot as best she could and went back inside and stood at the window for a moment looking at the yard, the barn with its repaired roof, the marker stakes by the garden, the mountains beyond all of it with their retreating snow line. She was trying to take an accurate reading of where she was, not just physically, in terms of geography and circumstance, but in terms of herself. The woman who had knocked on that door in the blizzard had been someone mostly subtracted from, the way repeated erasure removes not just mistakes but the surface itself. She'd been afraid in ways she hadn't fully admitted, including to herself. She wasn't afraid now. That was the thing she was trying to locate clearly. She was something else, something she didn't have a clean word for. Cautious, maybe, in the careful way of someone handling something real. Rowan was real. This place was real. The thing growing between them, whatever it was and however slowly and awkwardly it was growing, was real, and she had arrived at the point where she couldn't pretend it wasn't and wasn't sure she wanted to. She went back to the kitchen and started on the evening meal. He came in an hour later smelling of horses and cold air and sat at the table and put his hands around the coffee cup she'd left waiting on the table for him, and neither of them said anything about it. The days kept lengthening. The garden came up. Small green shoots appeared in the rows she'd made, improbably determined, and she checked them every morning the way you check on something you're almost afraid to want. Rowan came with her sometimes, standing at the edge of the garden with his coffee while she knelt in the rows, not saying much, looking at the shoots with an expression that was different from the mountain-watching look, closer in somehow, more present. One morning she looked up from the garden and found him watching her rather than the plants. He looked away immediately, back at the mountains. She looked back at the garden. The frogs kept going near the creek. The light kept arriving earlier each morning, staying longer each evening. And in the valley below, in the town of Red Haven with its opinions and its loudly held certainties, someone had noticed the smoke rising from Rowan Creed's chimney and started doing arithmetic about who was producing it. Neither of them knew that yet. They only knew the garden was coming up, and the barn was repaired, and the coffee was hot, and somewhere between the worst winter either of them had survived and the first real warmth of an improbable spring, the cabin had quietly, without ceremony or announcement, become something neither of them had expected to find again. The first sign that something had shifted in town came from the feed merchant. Rowan had ridden into Red Haven on a Tuesday in late April, a supply run he made every few weeks. Flour, oil, salt, things the ranch couldn't produce. He'd been making the same trip to the same store for 6 years, and the merchant, a compact, watchful man named Aldous Pruitt, had always been straightforward with him. Not warm, exactly. Red Haven had never been warm toward Rowan. Not since he'd come back from burying his family and made it clear he had no interest in rejoining the social machinery of the valley, but functional, professional. The kind of transactional courtesy that made commerce possible between people who wouldn't otherwise choose each other's company. This time, Pruitt took longer than usual to bring the order around. He was doing something in the back that required his full attention, apparently, and the two men who'd been lingering near the door when Rowan walked in were still lingering when Rowan was ready to leave. And they watched him load his horse with the particular quality of attention that isn't curiosity so much as inventory taking. Rowan noticed. He noticed everything, always had. It was what made him a good trapper, the ability to read small changes in an environment and understand what they signified. He just didn't yet know what this particular change signified, so he filed it and rode home. He didn't mention it to Evelyn. The second sign came a week later. A woman named Dora Henshaw, who ran the dry goods store and had occasionally sold Rowan thread and needles without making it a social event, sent her boy out to flag him down in the street when he passed. She pressed into his hand a paper-wrapped parcel of buttons and a spool of dark thread that Evelyn had asked about on a previous trip, things too small to justify a special order but that Dora had apparently sourced anyway. Rowan paid her fairly and thanked her, and she leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping. "People are talking," she said, not unkindly. "More the way you tell someone there's a storm coming, because you think they should know, and you're not sure anyone else is going to tell them." "About what?" Rowan said. Dora looked at him. "About the widow at your place," she said. "The Blackwood woman. People have been saying things." "What kind of things?" She folded her hands on the counter with the deliberateness of someone choosing their words carefully. "The Blackwood family has been talking. Gideon Blackwood has been in town twice in the last month. He's been talking to people. Edmund, too, once." She paused. "They're saying she ran off with you, voluntarily, that it's been going on since before Daniel died." Rowan stood very still for a moment. "That's a lie," he said. "I know what it is," Dora said. "I'm telling you what's being said." He rode home with Dora's information sitting in his chest like a stone he'd accidentally swallowed, working through the implications carefully. The Blackwoods had not simply abandoned Evelyn and moved on. They had constructed a story, were circulating it with purpose, were building the kind of narrative that once established was nearly impossible to dismantle. And Gideon Blackwood specifically making trips to town to talk to people was not a man putting something behind him. That was a man preparing something. He told Evelyn that evening. She was at the table repairing a tear in the knee of his work trousers. She'd taken over most of the mending with a matter-of-factness that had stopped being remarkable around February. And she listened to him lay it out without interrupting, her hands going still in her lap when he got to the part about what Gideon was saying. "He told people it was before Daniel died," she said. "Yes." She looked at her hands, then at the trousers, then at some point past both. "He knows that isn't true." "Doesn't matter what he knows," Rowan said. "Matters what people believe. I never met you before the night of the blizzard." "I know that." "I didn't know you existed." She said it with a flatness that told him she was working hard on keeping the anger at a manageable level. "I didn't know this cabin existed. They drove me out here in a storm and left me on a road that leads nowhere." I know. And now he's making it into something that justifies what they did. She pressed her fingers together, so that when people hear about how I was abandoned, they'll already have a reason why it was my fault. Rowan was quiet. Because yes, that was exactly what Gideon was doing, and it was effective, and it was ugly, and there wasn't a clean, immediate response to it. You couldn't fight a story with a denial. Denials just made the story louder. What does he want? She asked. My guess? He wants you back under the family's control. Or he wants you gone from this valley entirely so there's no one left who can tell the real version of what happened. She looked at him directly. And you? What does this do to you? He had thought about that on the ride home, had turned it over from several angles, looking at it the way you look at a problem before committing to a solution. His reputation in Red Haven was already minimal. He'd spent 6 years reducing his presence in that town to the absolute necessary, and whatever social standing he'd once had, he'd long since stopped caring about. But this was different. This was the kind of talk that followed a man and changed the way he moved through the world, made transactions harder, made enemies where there'd previously just been strangers. I've been managing this valley's opinion of me for 6 years, he said. I'll manage it. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now. She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked the trousers back up and found the needle and went back to the repair, and the set of her jaw was different than it had been 5 minutes ago, tighter, internal, the particular expression of someone making a private decision that she's not yet ready to share. He should have pushed her on that. He knew it later. But he let it go, because they were both learning that sometimes the other person needed to sit with something before they could talk about it, and he'd gotten into the habit of respecting that. It was the last quiet week they got. Gideon Blackwood arrived on a Thursday in the second week of May. There were 4 of them. Gideon plus 3 men from the Blackwood operation, hired men who were paid specifically for situations like this, which was to say situations where a Blackwood needed muscle that could be attributed to something other than the family directly. Rowan heard them before he saw them, the sound of multiple horses carrying riders who weren't trying to be quiet, and he came out of the barn to find them coming through the gate with the unhurried confidence of men who had decided how this visit was going to go before they arrived. Gideon had his father's build without his father's restraint about showing it. He was a large man who moved like he expected things to get out of his way, dressed better than the ranch setting required in a coat that said money and a hat that said authority. He had a way of surveying a space that was less about looking and more about appraising. The same way he'd looked at Evelyn in the parlor, like she was something on a ledger. He looked at Rowan the same way now. Creed, he said, just the name, no greeting in it. Blackwood, Rowan said, and folded his arms and waited. Gideon looked around the yard, the garden with its early green showing, the repaired barn, the smoke from the chimney. His expression did something complicated for a moment, the look of a man revising an assumption. She's been here all winter, he said. She was left on a mountain road in a blizzard, Rowan said. Yes. We arranged transportation to the family property. You arranged abandonment and called it transportation. Rowan kept his voice level. This was not the time for anger. Anger gave the other man something to work with. What do you want, Gideon? I want to speak with Evelyn. That's her decision. She's a Blackwood widow. Family matters are... She's a widow, Rowan said. That's where the Blackwood part ends. She doesn't carry that name and she doesn't carry your family's claim on her. She's a free woman, and whether she speaks with you is up to her. Gideon's jaw moved. He wasn't used to being corrected in that tone, clearly. Wasn't used to a flat refusal delivered without any of the deference he expected when he showed up with 3 large men behind him. I'd like to speak with her, he said again, with a slightly different emphasis. Then ask her. Evelyn came out of the cabin. Rowan hadn't heard the door, but she was there. Coat on, hands at her sides, standing in the yard with her chin level and her eyes on Gideon with an expression he recognized. It was the expression from the parlor story she'd told him, the folded hands, and the nothing said while a Blackwood man explained the world to her. Except the expression was the same and the posture was different. She wasn't folded inward. She was standing at her full height. Gideon, she said. Evelyn. He looked her over the same appraising way. You look well, considering that I was left to walk 12 miles in a blizzard. Something moved across Gideon's face. There was a miscommunication about the... There was no miscommunication, she said. You told me to get out of the wagon, and you told me I knew the way from there. Those are not words that leave room for miscommunication. The three hired men shifted slightly on their horses. Gideon held very still the way he did when he was recalibrating, reassessing the variables in front of him. Be that as it may, he said, the family has discussed the situation and we'd like you to come back to the estate. You'll have your own room, a reasonable allowance, and... No, she said. He stopped. I won't, she said. Not a room in the servant wing. Not another version of what I had before. Not another year of being managed into smaller and smaller spaces until I disappear completely. She said it without heat, and that was the remarkable thing, Rowan thought, watching her. Not cold exactly, just clear, the way the air gets clear after weather passes. I'm staying here. Gideon looked at Rowan, then back at her. You understand what people are saying. I'm sure I can imagine. They're saying you've been living in sin with a man who isn't your husband, in my brother's memory. Do you understand what that means for your reputation, for any future you might have? My future was fine until your family drove it into a ditch, she said, and I think we both know what people are saying originated with you. The hit landed. Gideon's expression shifted. Not guilt, not quite. More like irritation at having an accurate thing said to him directly. You have no proof of... I don't need proof, she said. I need to be clear with you so there's no confusion later. She took a step forward, and there was something in that single step that changed the geometry of the conversation. Rowan found me nearly frozen in his barn during the worst storm in 40 years. He gave me shelter. He taught me how to survive out here. He treated me better in 3 months than your family did in 3 years, and I will not be moved from this place by you or anyone else. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Rowan with an expression that had sharpened into something less performative and more honest. Genuine anger, genuine contempt, and under both of those, something that was probably closer to fear. Because Evelyn standing in that yard saying those things was a version of events he couldn't control. A woman who wouldn't be moved was a problem that his usual methods couldn't solve. You're making a mistake, he said to her. I've made mistakes, she said. I know what they feel like. This isn't one. Gideon sat on his horse for another moment, looking at her. Then at Rowan. His jaw moved once. This isn't finished, he said. It is for today, Rowan said. Gideon turned his horse. His 3 men turned with him. They rode back through the gate and down the trail, and the sound of their horses faded into the trees, and the yard was quiet again except for the birds and the creak of the gate settling back on its hinge. Evelyn stood where she was for a moment after they'd gone. Then her shoulders dropped about half an inch. Not dramatically, just the specific release of tension that a body holds when braced for impact that has temporarily passed. She turned and looked at Rowan. Well, she said. You didn't tell me you were coming out, he said. I heard his voice. She looked at the gate. I wasn't going to stay inside. He wanted to tell her that had been unnecessarily risky, that Gideon with 3 men at his back was not a situation that benefited from additional confrontation. He looked at her face and understood that she knew all of that already, and had come out anyway, not out of recklessness but out of something else. The specific refusal of a person who had spent years being managed and hidden and reduced to say yes, she would be managed and hidden and reduced again. It was brave, he said. It was angry, she said. They're not always different things. He thought about that. No, he said. They're not. She looked at the garden for a moment, at the young plants coming up in their rows, and then back at him. He'll be back. Yes. And he'll do what he said. Make it worse in town. Probably. I'm sorry, she said. It's my problem, what I brought here, and it's landing on you. You didn't bring it, he said. They did. When they put you out in the blizzard. Everything after that is on them, not you. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully decode, gratitude in it, but something more complicated underneath, the look of a person receiving something they'd stopped expecting to receive. Okay, she said quietly. Okay, he said. They went back inside and she put water on for coffee, and neither of them spoke much for a while. But it was a different kind of silence than the early ones, biché, not distance, not the careful neutrality of 2 strangers negotiating shared space. This was the silence of two people sitting inside something serious together and not flinching away from it. What Gideon had promised came to pass within the week. It started with small things, the way these things always start. Rowan went into town for supplies, and Aldous Pruitt was slower than usual with the order and kept his eyes on the counter, and the price he quoted was higher than the usual rate. Not dramatically, not enough to prove intent, just enough to communicate something. When Rowan pointed it out, Pruitt said there'd been a price adjustment, set it to a spot approximately 2 feet to Rowan's left. On the same trip, someone threw a rock through the window of the harness shop while Rowan's horse was tied outside it. The shop owner came out looking more frightened than angry, and the rock had a piece of paper tied to it that Rowan picked up and read and put in his coat pocket. He didn't show Evelyn that paper. He burned it when he got home. Then the Henshaw boy, Dora's son, 12 years old, who had been running errands between properties and occasionally stopping at the ranch for water on warm days with the ease of a child who hasn't yet learned to treat people according to what adults say about them, stopped coming by. Rowan noticed his absence after a week. He didn't ask Dora about it directly, because doing so would put her in a difficult position, and she had already taken a risk telling him what she'd told him. Evelyn noticed everything too. She was sharper than she sometimes let on, had the quality of a person who had spent years in an environment where missing small signals had consequences, and she read the reports Rowan brought back from town with a precision that told him she was building the same picture he was. One evening in the 3rd week of May, she was quiet through most of dinner, not the companionable quiet they'd developed, but a heavier kind, the inward-turned silence of someone working through a problem they haven't yet decided to share. Rowan ate and let it be. Refilled their cups and waited. "I could go to Millhaven," she said finally. Millhaven was a town 40 miles east, over the first ridge. "Start over. Different name, maybe. Find work there before whoever Gideon's talked to has thought to talk to anyone in Millhaven." Rowan set his cup down. "You've been thinking about that," he said. "I've been trying to think practically. Running because Gideon Blackwood told lies about you isn't practical," he said. "It's just giving him what he wants." "What he wants," she said, "is for me to come back to the estate. Running east doesn't give him that." "No," Rowan said, "but it gives him the story. It proves, in the minds of everyone watching, that there was something to run from. You leave, people will say you left because the accusations were true. That version of you follows you to Millhaven and everywhere after." She looked at the table. He could see she'd already thought of this and had been hoping he'd say something that disproved it. "So I stay and the town makes both our lives smaller," she said. "Maybe. That's not nothing." "No," he said. "It isn't." She was quiet again. Then, "Rowan, do you want me to go?" He looked at her, at the directness of the question, which was the kind Evelyn asked when she'd decided to stop circling and just say the thing. "No," he said. One word. She looked at him, and he looked back at her, and neither of them elaborated, because the word had already said what it needed to say. "Okay," she said, for the second time in recent memory, using that word to mean something larger than its size. The tension between what they were and what it was becoming had been building in the cabin for weeks, in the way that pressure builds in weather, not dramatically, but with the kind of steadiness that eventually has to find release. It arrived on a warm evening near the end of May, not with any planned conversation, but the way the real ones usually happen, unexpectedly, as a consequence of something ordinary. Rowan had come in from a long day on the far property line, surveying storm damage from earlier in the week, and he was tired in the way that goes past physical and into something harder to name. He sat at the table with his hands on the surface and his eyes closed for a moment, and Evelyn, who had heard him come in, looked at him from across the room and simply came and sat across from him the way she might sit with a friend, without asking if he wanted company, without the careful permissions they'd been seeking from each other for months. Just sat down and put her own hands on the table and was present. He opened his eyes. She was looking at him with an expression that was open in a way he wasn't used to seeing from her or anyone, unguarded in that specific way of someone who has made a decision they're not going to walk back. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I'm not staying because of the garden," she said, "or because I don't have options, or because leaving would look like running." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "I'm staying because of you, because of what this is. Because the last time I felt like a person who mattered to someone was when Daniel was alive, and he couldn't protect me the way he wanted to. And I told myself after he died that I wasn't going to need that from anyone again. She stopped, pushed past the stopping. I was wrong about that. Or, I don't know, maybe I was wrong specifically about you. He looked at her for a long moment. At her hands on the table, the direct, clear line of her eyes, the slight tension in her shoulders that said she was braced for this to go badly, and had come out with it anyway because she was fundamentally someone who chose honesty over protection, even when protection was the easier option. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not a gesture loaded with poetry. Just his hand, rough from work and cold from being outside, placed over her hands. But she turned her palm up beneath it and held on, and that was its own kind of answer. I haven't... He stopped, started differently. It's been a long time since I let anything matter again, he said. I didn't think I was capable of it anymore. Or I told myself I wasn't, which might be the same thing. Are you telling me you might be wrong about that? She asked. His expression shifted in the way it had started shifting in recent months. The subtle movements she'd learned to read behind the flatness. Something that reached his eyes and stayed there. Specifically about you, he said. Outside, the spring evening was settling into dark, the last light going pink over the mountains. The dogs were asleep near the door. The garden was coming up in its rows. And in the town of Red Haven, Gideon Blackwood was sitting in the saloon with his second whiskey, planning something that would, within the week, make everything harder. Neither of them knew that yet. They only knew the warmth of the cabin and the weight of two hands holding on in the near dark. And for that evening, that was the only thing that needed to be true. The window went first. It was the cabin's single front window, the one with Evelyn's blue curtains. And it happened at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday, a rock the size of a fist that came through the glass and landed on the floor 6 inches from where Scout was sleeping. The dog was on her feet and barking before the glass finished falling, which woke Rowan, who was across the room in 3 steps with the rifle from beside the door before he'd fully processed being awake. Evelyn was already sitting up on the bed, completely still, eyes open. He went to the door and opened it and stood in the frame looking out at the yard. Nothing moved. The night was moonlit enough to see the fence, the gate, the trail beyond it, and there was nobody there. Whoever had thrown it was already gone, had planned the distance and the exit before they threw, which meant it wasn't impulsive. It was a message delivered with forethought. He closed the door. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," Evelyn said. "Scout?" The dog had stopped barking and was standing in the middle of the room looking alert and unhappy. Rowan checked her over quickly. No cuts from the glass. She'd been lucky. And then looked at the rock on the floor and the window above it, cold air coming through the empty frame in a steady pour. He boarded it up with a piece of wood from the barn. It took 20 minutes in the dark and the cold, and when he came back in, Evelyn had swept up the glass and was standing at the table with her arms folded and an expression that was doing the same thing it had done when she came out to face Gideon in the yard, holding anger at a functional level rather than letting it run loose. "This is escalating," she said. "Yes." "How bad does it get before it stops?" He set the hammer down on the table. He didn't have a clean answer for that, and she knew him well enough by now to read the silence accurately. "That bad," she said. "Possibly." She looked at the boarded window. "I keep thinking about what you said, that leaving proves the story." She turned back to him. "But staying is costing you." "Staying is costing us," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him with the expression she got when he said something that surprised her, the slight adjustment of her eyes that she probably didn't know was visible. "Go back to sleep," he said. "I'll take the first part of the night." "You need sleep too." "I've slept on worse." She looked at him for another moment, then went back to the bed, and he sat in the chair by the boarded window with the rifle across his knees and listened to the dark outside and thought about the shape of the problem they were in. The shape of it was this. Gideon Blackwood had resources, patience, and a story that was already circulating. He didn't need to do anything dramatic. He just needed to make living in this valley uncomfortable enough, for long enough, that either Rowan gave up and sent Evelyn away to reduce his own trouble, or Evelyn decided the cost to Rowan was too high and left on her own. Both outcomes achieved Gideon's goal. Evelyn displaced, her version of events discredited, the family narrative secured. Rowan sat with that until the sky started to lighten, and by the time morning arrived, he had worked through most of it and come out the other side of it with a clarity that felt like decision. He didn't act on it yet, because it needed Evelyn, and Evelyn needed to arrive at it herself rather than be guided there. He knew her well enough to know the difference mattered. 2 days after the window, the supply run to Redhaven produced the second clear escalation. Pruitt wouldn't serve him at all this time. Looked at him when he came through the door and said, without meeting his eyes, that he couldn't take his business anymore. No explanation, no argument about it, just a flat refusal delivered to the space beside Rowan's left ear. Rowan stood at the counter for a moment. "Pruitt," he said, "you've been taking my business for 6 years." "Things change," Pruitt said, still not looking at him. "What changed?" Silence. "Who came to see you?" Rowan said. Pruitt's jaw moved once. He was a man being squeezed between two forces, and he knew Rowan could see it, and the knowledge made him angrier than he probably intended. "I'd appreciate if you'd leave," he said. Rowan left. He got what he needed from the general store at the end of the main street, paying slightly more than he would have at Pruitt's, and on his way back to his horse, he passed 3 men standing outside the saloon who watched him with the deliberate attention of people who had been told to watch. He didn't recognize 2 of them. The third was one of the men who had ridden in with Gideon 3 weeks earlier. He rode home at a controlled pace, not hurrying, because hurrying would have communicated something he didn't want communicated. He told Evelyn over dinner. She listened without interrupting, her hand still on the table in front of her, and when he finished, she was quiet for long enough that he could hear the fire and the dogs, and the specific silence of someone reorganizing their understanding of a situation. "He's systematically cutting off the supply lines," she said. "Yes, so that even if we stay, we can't function, can't get supplies, can't do business in town." She paused. "It's the same thing he did to me at the estate. Different scale." Rowan hadn't thought of it in those terms. The parallel between the 14 months she'd described and the current pressure campaign. But she was right. It was the same method. Slow attrition, reduce the options, wait for the isolation to do the work. "He's patient," Rowan said. "He always has been," she said. "He waited 3 years with me. He's not in a hurry." She ate the rest of dinner without saying much. Then she helped clear the table and she stood at the basin washing the dishes with her back to him, and she was working through something. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, the particular quality of tension that meant she was having a conversation with herself she hadn't finished yet. He let her have it. What he didn't know was the part she wasn't saying out loud, that she was constructing quietly and methodically a plan to leave. Not to run, she was clear with herself about the distinction, but to remove herself as the source of the problem, to take Gideon's target away from this place, and from this man who had given her winter and work, and the slow return of something she'd thought was gone permanently. She packed the traveling case on a Thursday morning before the sun came up. Not everything. She wasn't taking the flannel shirt he'd given her that first cold week. She folded it and set it on the chair with a care that took more effort than it should have. She packed what was actually hers. The poetry book, almost fully read now. Her own clothes. The small purse with the money she'd saved from the household accounts. A careful accumulation over the weeks that Rowan had said she should keep for her own use. She wrote a note. Tried several versions. The first 2 were too long and the third was too short, and the fourth was the honest one, which she left on the table under the coffee cup so he'd find it when he woke. She put on her coat. She was reaching for the traveling case when she heard him outside. The window was still boarded. They hadn't replaced the glass yet because glass required a trip to Redhaven, and Redhaven was currently complicated. But there was a gap at the edge of the board, and through it she could see the pre-dawn gray of the yard and Rowan moving through it. He was at the section of fence that had taken damage in last week's windstorm, working in the cold and the dark and the intermittent freezing rain that had started sometime in the night, replacing the broken rails with the same methodical attention he gave everything. No hurry, no complaint about the conditions, just the work that needed doing, done in the dark because it was available dark, and the work didn't care about the light. She stood with the traveling case in her hand and watched him through the gap in the board for a long moment. He wasn't doing it for her. That was the thing. He wasn't repairing the fence as a demonstration of devotion or a signal of commitment or any of the performed gestures she had learned to recognize and distrust in 3 years of Blackwood family life, where nothing was done without an audience and an intended effect. He was fixing the fence because the fence was broken, and it was his fence and it needed fixing, and that was all. He would have been doing the same thing if she weren't there. He would be doing the same thing after she left, and the week after that, and the month after that. Because this was who he was. A man who showed up for the work without requiring anyone to witness him doing it. She set the traveling case down. She stood in the dark cabin for another minute, the note on the table and the packed case on the floor and the boarded window with its gap, and she felt the decision she'd been building for the last 3 days simply dissolve. Not because she'd talked herself out of it rationally, not because a better plan had presented itself. It dissolved because she understood something she hadn't quite let herself understand before. Running was a story too, and it was a story that ended with her alone. She picked up the note and fed it into the fire. She unpacked the traveling case and put the flannel shirt back where it belonged. When Rowan came in from the fence, wet and cold and pulling off his gloves, she was at the stove with coffee on, and she turned and looked at him and said, "I want to go into town." He stopped taking off his gloves. "Both of us," she said, "together, to the community meeting on Saturday." He looked at her. The community meetings in Red Haven were monthly affairs held in the church hall. Practical things, mostly, water rights and road maintenance and the various disputes that came from people living in proximity. But they were also the place where the valley took its public temperature, where positions got stated and alliances got visible. Going to that meeting together was not a small thing. It was the opposite of running. It was walking directly into the middle of the thing they'd been being pushed out of. "You want to go to the meeting," he said slowly. "I want to stop letting Gideon control the story," she said. "He's been telling it for months in every direction, and we've been out here saying nothing, and the silence is starting to look like admission. I want to go in there and be seen and say the true version out loud where people can hear it." He was quiet. "I'm not asking you to fight anyone," she said. "I'm asking you to walk into a room with me." "Those might be the same thing," he said. "Maybe," she said, "but we've been losing ground by not moving. I'd rather lose it by moving." He stood in the middle of the cabin with his coat dripping on the floor, looking at her. She looked back. She could see him working through it, the risk, the likelihood of it going badly, the specific ways it could go badly, set against the alternative, which was a slow-managed disappearance from their own valley. "All right," he said. She let out a breath. "But we go in the morning," he said, not charging in half prepared. "We think through what gets said and who says it." "Agreed." "And Evelyn." He looked at her directly. "Once we walk in there, we don't walk back out until it's said. All of it. No retreating to halfway." "No retreating," she said. They spent Friday going over it, not scripting. Both of them knew scripted things fell apart under pressure, but making sure they both understood the actual truth of what had happened well enough to say it clearly under stress. Rowan wasn't a man who used many words, but the ones he chose were accurate, and he'd lived the same winter she had and could speak to it from where he stood, which was different from where she stood and therefore more useful. She rehearsed the timeline in her head. The wagon, the road, the barn, the months of shared work and shared survival. The story Gideon had built against them. She rehearsed it the way you rehearse a thing you actually lived, not memorizing words but refreshing the reality of it so the words would come from somewhere true. They slept poorly that night. Both of them, separately, in the way people don't sleep when they're running a scenario on a loop. She could hear from his breathing that he was awake across the room, and she suspected he could hear the same from her, but neither of them said anything about it. Sometimes the kindest thing is to let another person pretend they're managing. Saturday morning arrived clear and cold, the mountains sharp-edged against a sky that had none of spring's usual haze. They dressed, ate, handled the morning chores without speaking much. There was a specific quality to the silence, not tense exactly, but loaded, the way silence gets when two people are both holding the same weight. Rowan hitched the wagon. Evelyn put on the best coat she had, which was not very good, and didn't apologize for it. They rode into Red Haven side by side. The meeting was already half full when they arrived, which was by design. Rowan had suggested arriving after people were seated so their entrance would be seen clearly, rather than absorbed into the noise of arrival. It worked. The room registered them immediately. That particular shift in ambient sound when a space full of people simultaneously notices something and adjusts its own volume in response. Gideon was there. He was seated near the front with two men from the estate, and he turned when they entered with the expression of someone who had not expected this specific development, which told Evelyn that despite everything, despite the pressure campaign and the planning, he had underestimated her. She wasn't surprised. He always had. The meeting's nominal business took 40 minutes. Water rights, a property boundary dispute, plans for repairing the South Road. People spoke. People argued mildly. The usual machinery of community business moved through its paces while Evelyn sat beside Rowan in the third row and kept her hands still in her lap and waited. The chair of the meeting, a heavy, fair-minded man named Corbin Stills, who had been running these meetings for a decade and had a quality of exhausted impartiality that came from spending 10 years refereeing community disputes, was moving to close the general business when Gideon stood. "I have a matter for community consideration," he said. Stills looked at him. Stills looked at Rowan. Stills had the expression of a man who has just realized the meeting he's been running has been building towards something he didn't know about. "The floor is yours," he said, with a notable lack of enthusiasm. Gideon addressed the room the way he always addressed any space, as though it existed for his use. He laid out his version of events with the practiced fluency of someone who had told it many times. Evelyn, an unstable woman, had taken up with Rowan Creed prior to Daniel's death. She had dishonored her husband's memory. She was living in a situation that was immoral and a poor reflection on the valley's standards. The family had attempted to make alternative arrangements. He described the wagon ride with a version that bore no resemblance to what had actually happened, and she had refused to cooperate. He was good at it. Rowan had to grant him that. He was smooth and credible, and he knew this room and most of the people in it, and he knew which details to emphasize and which to leave vague. And the room was listening with the particular attention of people who wanted the story they were hearing to be true because it made the world simpler. Stills looked at Rowan when Gideon finished. "Creed, you have a response." Rowan stood. He wasn't a man who'd been socialized to hold rooms. He'd spent 6 years specifically avoiding rooms. And the first 2 seconds were visibly effortful, his hands at his sides, his jaw set, working through the adjustment of standing in front of a large number of people who were watching him with varying degrees of hostility and curiosity. Then he spoke. "Everything he just said about how it started is false," he said. "I'd never met Evelyn Hart before the night she knocked on my door half frozen after walking 4 miles from where the Blackwood wagon left her. In a blizzard. 6 miles from the nearest shelter and 12 from the property they claimed they were taking her to." He laid out what had actually happened the same way he'd approach any practical problem, methodically, without embellishment, with the specific kind of authority that comes from someone who was present and isn't trying to make the story more than it was. He talked about the storm. He talked about the barn roof collapsing. He talked about a woman who had come into his home with almost nothing and rebuilt the place from the inside out while learning to survive in conditions she'd never been prepared for. He talked about the months of silence while Gideon circulated his version of events and what that silence had cost them in terms of supply and community relationship. He was not eloquent. He stumbled twice on words and once lost the thread of a sentence and had to start it again. But he was real, which was a different quality from eloquent, and in that room at that moment was considerably more useful. "She's a widow," he said. "She lost her husband. Then she lost whatever life she'd built because his family decided she was inconvenient. She nearly lost her life in a storm because those same people would rather have her dead in the snow than somewhere they couldn't control her." He looked at the room. "That's the story. It's not complicated and it isn't interesting, but it's true." He sat down. The room was doing something complicated with itself. The murmur of people revising, people resistant to revising, people looking at Gideon for his counter, people looking at Evelyn, who was still sitting precisely still in the third row. Stills looked at her. "Mrs. Hart." She stood. And here was the thing about Evelyn Hart that several people in that room who had known her as a Blackwood wife didn't know and were about to learn. She was, when she decided to be, exceptionally clear. "Everything Rowan said is accurate," she said. "I can give you dates and details if you want them. I can tell you which day of which month I arrived, what the temperature was, what condition I was in, and exactly what was said before I was put out of that wagon." She looked at Gideon. "I can tell you about the doctor's reports that were altered. I can tell you about the mail that was intercepted. I can tell you about the 3 years I spent being systematically reduced inside that house until I had nothing left that was mine. She turned back to the room. I'm not asking this community for anything, she said. I'm not asking you to take my side or declare in my favor or punish the Blackwoods for what they did to me. I'm only asking you to stop letting one family control what is and isn't considered true in this valley. Because what's being done to Rowan right now, the refusals of service, the pressure on the merchants, the men watching outside the saloon, that will be done to the next person who gets in the Blackwoods' way, and the one after that. That's not a community. That's a family running a territory. The room was very quiet. Gideon stood up. You don't have one piece of evidence for any of— Sit down, Gideon, said a woman's voice from the back of the room. Dora Henshaw. Standing with her hands folded at her waist, her expression the same one she'd had when she'd told Rowan that people were talking. That flat, factual, I've made a decision look that sensible people get when they've finally decided the comfortable position is no longer available to them. She's telling the truth, Dora said. I've seen the pressure campaign in my own store. My own store. I've had men I don't know ask me about my business with Rowan Creed and suggest I might want to reconsider it. She looked at Gideon. One of them was your man. I recognized him from when you came through last year buying feed. Gideon's expression had gone very still. It wasn't over in the room after that. These things are never over cleanly. They leave residue. They need time to settle. There were arguments. Voices got raised. Stills had to call for quiet twice, and on the third time knocked the table hard enough that his water glass fell over, and that finally produced the necessary pause. A man Rowan didn't know well stood and said he'd been told to watch the ranch, and he'd done it for money, and he thought people in the room should know who'd given him the money, and he said the name. Gideon stood with his jaw tight and his hands and fists at his sides and looked at Rowan with the expression of a man recalibrating what he was willing to do next. It wasn't defeat. Rowan could read that clearly. It was tactical retreat. A man deciding that this particular arena on this particular day had turned against him, but that the war was not concluded. This isn't finished, Gideon said, which was almost exactly what he'd said in the yard at the ranch. I know, Rowan said, but it's finished for today. Gideon walked out. His 2 men followed. The room exhaled. Stills looked at the gathered community with the expression of a man who had not signed up for any of this and was putting his name down now only because the alternative was worse. I think, he said carefully, that we've identified some issues that require the community's attention. I'd like to propose we convene a smaller group next week to discuss appropriate responses to some of what's been described. It wasn't justice. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a declaration. But in the back of the room, Dora Henshaw sat back down with a look of quiet satisfaction, and 2 other people Rowan didn't know well nodded at him as they left, the small nod of acknowledgement that costs a person something in a community where allegiance has consequences. Outside in the pale spring light, with the wagon on the street and the town of Red Haven doing its usual business around them as if nothing had happened inside that hall, Evelyn stood beside Rowan and breathed. Her hands were shaking slightly. She noticed this with a kind of distant observation, not from fear, not anymore, more like the release of something that had been held very tight for a very long time. You're shaking, Rowan said. I know. He didn't say anything else about it. He put his hand on her arm briefly, a touch that lasted about 4 seconds, and she felt it all the way through the coat and through everything under it, and then he took his hand back and looked at the street. Dora Henshaw, Evelyn said. Yeah, Rowan said. I didn't expect that. Neither did I. He was looking at something down the street, or maybe at nothing. People surprise you sometimes, not usually in the good direction, but sometimes. She stood beside him in the spring light with the mountains visible at the end of the main street, their snow line considerably lower now, the summer shapes of them beginning to emerge from under the white. And she thought that whatever came next, and something would come next, Gideon had made that clear. The fight wasn't concluded just because today had bent in their favor. They had done what needed doing. They had walked into the room. They had said the true version out loud. They had not run. The shaking in her hands was already stopping. Let's go home, she said. Rowan looked at her when she said the word. Home. Not the ranch, not your place, not out there. Home. He held her gaze for a moment, And then he turned and unhitched the horse and climbed up to the wagon seat, and she climbed up beside him. And they drove out of Red Haven together with the mountains ahead and the spring light all around them and the long, difficult road back still stretching out in front of them, full of everything that hadn't resolved yet. But behind them, the town watched them go, and not all of the watching was hostile. That was different from this morning. That was new. The week after the meeting, nothing happened. That was the part nobody had prepared them for. The strange, suspended quality of the days that followed, when they'd both been braced for immediate retaliation and instead got ordinary weather and ordinary work and ordinary mornings that felt faintly unreal, like a held breath that hadn't found its release yet. Rowan checked the gate every night before coming in. Evelyn found herself waking at small sounds the way she hadn't since January. They were both waiting, and the waiting had a particular texture to it, tiring in the specific way of sustained alertness. Gideon didn't come. By the end of the second week, Rowan let himself relax slightly. Not fully, not the way you relax when a threat is actually gone, but the degree of loosening that comes when you realize the immediate danger has receded to a manageable distance. He stopped sleeping with the rifle beside the chair. He went to Red Haven for supplies, and Pruitt's door was still closed to him, but Dora's store was not. And she served him with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had made her position clear and had no interest in discussing it further, which was exactly the right amount of acknowledgement. 2 other merchants accepted his business without incident. He didn't make a point of it. He paid. He thanked them. He left. But he noted it in the way you note small things that might become larger things, evidence of a shift in the atmosphere that was still too new to trust, but couldn't be ignored. He told Evelyn what he'd found in town, and she listened, and then went back to the kitchen garden without comment, which meant she was processing it the way she processed things that mattered, quietly, while doing something with her hands. The garden had come fully in by June. The peas she'd planted in early spring were producing more than 2 people could eat, which meant she had started bringing portions into town on Rowan's supply runs and leaving them with Dora and once with an older woman named Mrs. Calder who lived on the edge of Red Haven and had waved at Evelyn from her porch with the unself-conscious friendliness of someone too old to care about social risk. Mrs. Calder had lost her husband the previous winter and was managing a property alone at 71, and she and Evelyn had struck up an unlikely correspondence. Not formal letters, more like the occasional exchange of someone who had figured something out and wanted to share it. A recipe. A method for keeping rodents out of root vegetables. The specific technique for convincing a stubborn latch to stay closed in cold weather. Small, useful knowledge passed between 2 women who understood the value of it. Rowan watched this developing friendship with something he couldn't quite name. Not quite pleasure, not quite relief. Something in the vicinity of both. He'd been afraid, in a way he hadn't admitted directly, that the life he was offering was too isolated, too stripped down, that a woman who had grown up in a more connected world would eventually find the mountain ranch and its limited social radius insufficient. He hadn't said this fear out loud because saying it out loud would have required admitting how much the answer mattered. He didn't need to say it. Evelyn knew anyway. "I'm not lonely," she told him one evening in late June, unprompted, as if she'd been carrying his unasked question around long enough that it needed answering. "I know you've been wondering." He didn't deny it. "I was lonely at the estate," she said, "surrounded by people and completely alone. That's different from here." She was looking at the window, the one they'd finally replaced with real glass, no more board. The blue curtains were back. "Here, I'm present. I don't know how else to say it. I feel like I'm actually somewhere." He held that for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. It was their word, their small word for large things. Gideon's second move came in July, and it was different from what they'd been expecting. A lawyer arrived at the ranch, not Gideon himself, a deliberate choice, with a letter bearing the Blackwood seal and language dense enough with legal vocabulary that Evelyn had to read it 3 times before she understood what it was actually claiming. The letter argued that Daniel Blackwood had died without a properly witnessed final testament, that the verbal promises Edmund had made to Evelyn regarding the western property were unenforceable, and that Evelyn, as a widow without children, had no legal claim to any Blackwood asset or property and had in fact been trespassing on land adjacent to the Blackwood western boundary for the duration of her stay at the Creed Ranch. The last part was so clearly manufactured. The ranch and the Blackwood Western property didn't share a boundary by any legitimate survey, that Evelyn put the letter down on the table and laughed, which was not the reaction the lawyer had been expecting. He was a young man, the lawyer, and he had the uncomfortable look of someone who had taken a job and was now required to see it through in conditions he hadn't fully anticipated. He was standing in their kitchen holding his hat and looking at the woman who was supposed to be intimidated by his letter and was instead laughing at it. "I'm sorry," she said, composing herself. "The boundary claim. Which survey does that come from?" "The Blackwood family survey conducted by whom and when?" She looked at him with the direct, clear look she used when she wasn't going to let a thing slide. "Because I know that the territorial survey from 1871 puts the Blackwood Western boundary at Harrow Creek, and Harrow Creek is 4 miles from this property. So if there's a different survey, I'd very much like to know who conducted it and who paid for it." The lawyer was quiet for a moment. "I can pass along your questions to... You can also tell Gideon Blackwood," she said, "that if he wants to have a legal conversation about property boundaries, he can send someone with an actual case instead of a letter full of words arranged to look like a case." She picked up the letter and handed it back to him. "Take this with you, please. I don't want it in my house." The lawyer took his hat and his letter and left. Rowan had been standing near the back wall through all of this, having made the rapid and correct assessment that Evelyn had the situation managed, and his intervention would only complicate it. When the lawyer's horse was out of earshot, he looked at her. "You knew the survey line," he said. "Dor Henshaw's husband was a surveyor," she said. "She told me about the 1871 boundaries last month. I didn't know I'd need it specifically. I just wrote it down because it seemed like the kind of thing worth knowing." She smoothed the front of her dress with both hands, a gesture that meant she was coming down from something. "He's trying to make this legal instead of social. That means the social approach isn't working the way he wanted." Rowan thought about that. That could mean he's escalating. Or it could mean he's running out of options and reaching for tools that have longer timelines. She looked at him. Legal proceedings take years. Years of harassment through the courts costs money and produces uncertainty. That's what he's buying with this move. He wants us to spend the next 3 years anxious about a lawsuit that probably doesn't hold up. "Does it hold up?" "I don't know enough law to be certain," she said. "But the boundary claim is fabricated, and I can prove it, and the trespass argument falls apart the moment anyone looks at an independent survey." She paused. "I want to talk to a lawyer. Our own. Not the Blackwood one." Their own lawyer turned out to be a man in Mill Haven named Theodore Ames, who was 70 years old and had seen every variety of frontier property dispute in 4 decades of practice, and had a specific contempt for manufactured legal claims that he expressed in language of startling directness for a man of his profession. He reviewed the Blackwood letter, the 1871 survey, and the relevant territorial statutes in one afternoon and told them, without hedging, that the trespass claim was baseless, and the property boundary argument was fabricated from a survey he'd never heard of and suspected didn't exist. "What they're doing," Ames said, taking off his glasses and setting them on his desk, "is using legal language to achieve what intimidation hasn't. You file a counterclaim establishing the correct boundary, you document the harassment campaign, the window, the merchant pressure, the men outside the saloon, and you make it clear to the Blackwood family attorney that pursuing this will cost his clients considerably more than it cost you." He looked at them both over his desk. "The Blackwoods are a wealthy family with an established reputation. They have more to lose from a public proceeding than you do." "We're not wealthy," Rowan said. "No," Ames agreed. "But you have the truth, which is a functional substitute in proceedings where the other side is clearly lying. Judges notice that. They filed the counterclaim in August. Ames handled most of it, and what it cost them was real, a significant piece of what they had saved. But Rowan had looked at the alternative, which was years of manufactured uncertainty hanging over the ranch, and decided the cost was worth bearing now, rather than spreading it across years. The Blackwood family attorney responded within 3 weeks. The response was a reduction of the original claims. The trespass language was quietly dropped. The boundary claim was revised to a much smaller area that couldn't possibly be worth pursuing. It was a retreat dressed in procedural language, and Ames read it to them in his office with barely contained satisfaction. "They've calculated the exposure," he said. "A public proceeding with testimony about the winter abandonment, the alteration of medical records, The harassment campaign. That's not a proceeding the Blackwood family wins, even if they win on the technical points. Edmund Blackwood has political ambitions in this territory. That kind of testimony is not useful to political ambitions. So it's over? Evelyn asked. Ames put his glasses back on. The legal portion, I believe, is largely over. Gideon Blackwood is not a man who enjoys losing, and he may find other ways to express that. But the tools he's been using have cost him more than they've cost you at this point, and men like Gideon tend to redirect rather than double down when the math stops working in their favor. He was right. The legal threat dissolved over the following weeks. Not dramatically, not with any acknowledgement from the Blackwood side. Just a gradual cessation of pressure, the way a headache fades, noticeable only in retrospect. Pruitt's store remained closed to Rowan indefinitely, which Rowan had stopped caring about. The men outside the saloon stopped appearing. A second merchant in Red Haven, without explanation or comment, began accepting Rowan's business again. Dora Henshaw told Evelyn in September that she'd heard Edmund Blackwood had taken ill and was managing his affairs from the estate, which reduced Gideon's operational backing. She said it matter-of-factly, not unkindly, in the tone of someone reporting weather conditions. Here is what the situation is. Make of it what you will. Evelyn made the long walk back to the wagon after that conversation and sat for a moment before climbing up, looking at the mountains in the late September light. She felt something that she couldn't immediately name, sitting there. Not satisfaction exactly, not relief exactly. Something more complicated than either, the specific emotional texture of a threat that is past but has left its marks. She thought about the version of herself who had knocked on Rowan's door 8 months earlier, frozen and terrified and reduced to almost nothing. She thought about the distance between that woman and the one sitting in this wagon with a counterclaim filed and a kitchen garden harvested and a store of winter provisions she'd helped put up herself. The distance was real. She had covered it by moving through it, not around it. That was the only way. She climbed up and drove home. The proposal, such as it was, happened in October. It was not a romantic gesture in any formal sense. There was no kneeling, no ring produced from a pocket, none of the theatrical machinery that the word proposal usually implies. It was more of a conversation that arrived at a conclusion both of them had already reached separately and were finally ready to say out loud in the same room. They were splitting firewood, which had become Evelyn's task as much as Rowan's. She'd learned in the spring and had developed a competence at it that she was privately pleased about. The clean split of a well-aimed strike being one of those small physical satisfactions that stays rewarding no matter how many times you do it. It was a cold, clear afternoon, the aspens on the slope behind the property gone yellow, and they were working in the comfortable parallel rhythm of two people who had spent enough time doing physical work together that they didn't need to coordinate it consciously. Rowan set down the maul. "I want you to stay," he said. She kept her hands on the wood she was holding. "I am staying. Permanently," he said. "I want you to stay permanently, legally, if you're willing, as my wife." She set the wood down on the pile. He was looking at her with that direct look, not the flat, careful one, not the assessing one, but the open one, the window before someone remembers to close it. He'd been using it more often lately. He was getting less careful about closing it. "I know it's not," he started. "Yes," she said. He stopped. "Yes," she said again. "Not because I don't have options anymore and not because it's practical. Because I want to." She looked at him. "I've wanted to for a while. I was waiting for you to catch up." Something shifted across his face. A complicated movement, layers of it, things she could only partially read. He was a man who had spent 7 years believing that particular door was permanently closed, had organized his entire existence around it being closed, and the opening of it was not a simple thing, even when it was the right thing. She could see the weight of that in his face alongside everything else. "Okay," he said. She looked at him. He almost smiled. "Okay," he said again, with the full weight they had given that word over 9 months of using it for things too large for more complicated language. They were married in November by a justice of the peace in Millhaven, Theodore Ames, who turned out to hold the appointment in addition to his legal practice and performed the brief ceremony with the same practical efficiency he brought to everything, pausing only once to look at them both over his glasses with an expression that was approximately 70% legal formality and 30% something warmer. Dora Henshaw attended. Mrs. Calder attended, brought by her grandson, and cried in a way that she seemed genuinely embarrassed by and that Evelyn found unexpectedly moving. Two neighbors from properties adjacent to the ranch attended, men who had been cautiously civil since the church meeting and had gradually moved toward something that wasn't quite friendship, but was the honest precursor to it. It was small. It was imperfect. The justices' stove smoked badly, and they all stood in a light haze for the duration, and Rowan forgot the exact words he was supposed to repeat at one point, and Ames had to prompt him, and Evelyn's coat had a button missing at the collar that she'd meant to replace for 2 weeks. None of it mattered. The things that mattered were the words said and meant, the hands that held on in the cold afternoon light of a small office in Mill Haven, while outside the first winter snow of the season made its preliminary gestures against the window. The drive back to the ranch took 2 hours. They did it mostly in silence, but it was the deepest kind of silence. Not the absence of words, but the presence of something too full for words to be necessary. The mountains received them. The same mountains that had surrounded the worst winter of both their lives, and were now surrounding this, and the continuity of that, the same landscape holding such different things, struck Evelyn somewhere deep on the drive home. The mountains didn't change. The people moving through them did. That was the truth of any landscape, of any place. It holds everything that happens in it equally, and what you take from it is decided by what you bring. She had brought almost nothing, once. She was going home with considerably more. The first snow of genuine depth came in December, and they let it come this time without fear. The winter of the previous year had been survived. This one was going to be lived, which was a different project entirely. Rowan noticed it in small ways. The way the first real snowfall felt different than it had in years, less like a siege and more like a season. He noticed it in himself, which was more surprising. He'd been a man who endured winters for 7 years, got through them, checked them off. This winter he was present inside it in a way he hadn't been since before the fever had taken Margaret and Clara and reorganized the architecture of everything. He thought about them differently now. Not less. That wasn't it. Grief didn't work by subtraction, and anyone who told you otherwise was talking about a different thing than grief. He thought about them with the same love and the same loss. But the loss had found its place. It wasn't smaller. It had a location. It sat beside the things he now had rather than replacing them, and that was the arrangement he had spent 7 years not believing was possible. Clara would have been a full year older than Evelyn had calculated in the spring, he realized one evening. 17 now, not 16. He'd miscounted in the way you miscounted when you were trying not to count at all. The realization arrived without the usual blade sharpness of similar realizations. Not because it hurt less, but because sitting beside Evelyn at the table in the warm cabin while the snow fell outside, he could hold the pain of it alongside the warmth of this without one erasing the other. That was new. That was something. The pregnancy announced itself in late January. Evelyn had suspected for 2 weeks before she was certain enough to say it, and she'd spent those 2 weeks in the particular limbo of someone who desperately wants a thing to be true and is afraid to believe it too early. She said it on a Tuesday evening after dinner while the dogs were settling in and the fire was doing what fires do on cold nights, and Rowan was at the table with his carving. He'd started a new piece recently, something he'd been unusually private about, working on it with the curtained doorway closed when she wasn't in the main room. "I'm pregnant," she said. His hands went still. He looked at her. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Something measured, something guarded, because guarded was his natural language when it came to things that mattered this much. They had never talked explicitly about children. It was one of the territories they'd approached and moved around without entering, the way you move around a place that's been dangerous before. He set down the carving. He crossed the room and put both hands on her face, just held it, his rough hands on her face, and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, open in a way that had nothing careful left in it, nothing managed or measured, just the full unguarded weight of a man feeling something enormous and not trying to reduce it. "Are you all right?" he asked. His voice was lower than usual. "I'm all right," she said. "Are you?" He thought about it, which was a thing she loved about him, that he actually thought about the questions that deserved thinking about instead of producing the automatic answer. "I'm terrified," he said. "Me too." And he stopped, started again. I don't have another word for it. There isn't one that's big enough. No, she said. There isn't. He stayed there for a moment with his hands on her face, and she put her hands over his, and the fire cracked and the snow pressed against the windows, and Scout lifted her head from the floor to look at them with the patient attention of an animal that understands more about human emotion than it's credited with. The fear was real. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise, not even in the warm privacy of the cabin, not to herself, not to him. They had both lost things that couldn't be recovered. They both understood what it meant to have something precious enough to lose again. That understanding didn't go away just because you wanted it to, and she would not have trusted anyone who claimed it had. But fear was not the only thing. And fear was not going to be what ran their lives. That was the decision. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let it be in charge. She said this to Rowan 3 weeks later, on a February afternoon that was cold but not brutal, the particular cold of late winter that already has the idea of spring somewhere inside it. They were in the south field, the garden under its cover of snow, and she had walked out there for no specific reason, and he had followed because that was what they did. Noticed the other person moving and went along without needing an explanation. I keep waiting to be more afraid than I am, she said. I'm afraid. But I thought I'd be paralyzed by it, and I'm not. He was standing beside her looking at the snow-covered rows. What are you instead? She thought about it honestly. Ready, she said, and it surprised her a little to find that was the accurate word. Not confident, not certain. Those words implied an absence of doubt she didn't have and didn't want. Ready was different. Ready meant you were going towards something regardless of what it held. Rowan looked at the garden, the fence, the barn with its solid repaired roof, the cabin behind them with smoke coming from the chimney and the blue curtains visible through the window. Me too, he said. He'd finished the carving in early February. He showed her on a Sunday morning, brought it to the table and set it down in front of her with the same lack of ceremony he brought to most things, but she could see the slight tension in his hands that meant it mattered. It was a woman and a man standing side by side, carved from a single piece of wood so they couldn't be separated. Small enough to fit in a palm, the figures rough and sturdy and not idealized. The woman with her hair loose, the man with his familiar posture, both of them facing forward rather than toward each other, standing together the way people stand when they're facing the same direction, which is different from and more permanent than simply looking at each other. She picked it up. She turned it over. On the underside, carved in letters small enough that they were difficult to read without bringing it close to the light, 2 words. Still here. She looked at him. He was looking at the table, which was his way of giving her room to have whatever reaction she was going to have without the pressure of being watched. Rowan, she said. It's not the wolf, he said. I know it isn't the wolf. It's something else. She understood what he was saying. The wolf belonged to Clara. The wolf was Clara's, would stay Clara's, would sit on the high shelf where it had always sat, worn smooth from the handling of a 9-year-old girl who had been proud of the first thing she'd ever finished. This was something different, something that belonged to the life that had come after, built from the same hands but for different people, for the 2 of them and whatever came next. No, she said quietly. It isn't the wolf. She held the small carved figures in her palm. It's better. He looked at her then. It's ours, she said. Outside, the February cold was making its last real argument before spring arrived again to settle the debate. The mountains held their white, the creek ran dark under its ice, and somewhere down the Southfield slope the ground was waiting for the seeds that would go in again when the frost released it. All the same elements as a year ago, the same snow, the same mountains, the same ranch and its small accumulated life, entirely different because of who was standing in it. That was the thing about a place. It became what you made inside it. A man who had spent 7 years turning a cabin into a monument to absence had spent 1 more year turning it into something you could actually live in. Not because the grief was gone, but because grief, it turned out, was not incompatible with living. They existed alongside each other, the loss and the life, the way the mountains held both winter and the knowledge of summer at the same time. You didn't have to choose. Evelyn stood at the window that evening with the carved figures in her hand and looked at the snow and thought about the woman she had been the night she knocked on this door, desperate, cold, reduced to the bottom of what a person can carry. That woman had not disappeared. She was still in there, the memory of her, the knowledge of what it felt like to have everything taken. She wasn't interested in forgetting it. That knowledge was part of her now, part of what made her careful about the things that deserved care, sharp about the things that required sharpness, and honest about the difference. Home, she had learned, was not a place you were assigned. It was not a room you were given, or a name you were handed, or a position you occupied in someone else's arrangement. Home was the place where someone looked at you clearly, not the version of you that was useful to them, not the version that served their story, and chose to stand beside you anyway. She had knocked on this door with nothing. She was standing at this window with everything that mattered. Rowan came in from his barn and took off his coat and hung it on the hook and looked at her standing at the window with the snowlight on her face. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She turned. "Last February," she said, "and this one." He stood in the middle of the room, coat off, hands at his sides, looking at her with the expression she'd watched develop over a year, from something flat and closed to something that showed what it held. "That's a long distance," he said. "It is," she agreed. "We walked it, though." He looked at her for a moment. "We did," he said. The fire was going, the dogs were settled. Outside the mountains were doing what mountains do, standing in the cold and the dark, indifferent and permanent, holding every season equally. And inside the cabin, warm against all of it, two people who had each been broken in different ways by different losses stood in the same room they had both been afraid to want, and found that they were, improbably and without any guarantee of anything, still here. That was enough. That was, it turned out, everything.